Really, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today to speak to you in a panel of such distinguished experts and friends. And I'd really like to thank ICPAC and EDAD for organising this very timely event and discussion. As our earlier speakers have highlighted today, the adverse effects of climate change and disasters are increasingly contributing to human movements in ways that we are increasingly seeing reported and documented to give us a clearer sense of the scale and nature of the challenge. The sorts of movements we are seeing, as Nina has articulately indicated, include a range of different kinds of movements. They may take the form of migration as an adaptation strategy, sometimes voluntary and sometimes under extreme pressure due to lost livelihoods and other factors, sometimes in the form of planned relocation by individuals or communities, but sometimes also through displacement, referring to circumstances where people are forced to leave their homes. As IDMC's figures have shown us, a very great number of those forced to flee in such circumstances are internally displaced within the borders of their own countries, but some cross borders and seek protection from other countries. This can occur particularly where climate change and disasters act as threat multipliers. They can add to already prevailing stressors in societies or pre-existing vulnerabilities of people, exposing them in some cases to risks of serious harm or human rights violations. Acknowledging the impacts of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters on human rights and the displacement and protection needs they may trigger, UNHCR, in the course of the last year, has been working on developing a comprehensive strategic framework on climate action in consultation with partners and states. This includes 3 pillars. One pillar on the legal and normative aspects, addressing the needs for protection for people where displacement occurs in the context of climate change and disasters, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. A second pillar, and let me also belatedly perhaps call this up on my screen. I'm sorry, I thought it was available before, but now I see it's not. Very good. Okay, sorry. There you have the 3 pillars of UNHCR's framework. So the legal and normative approach, which I'll mention in a minute. Secondly, on the operational side, looking in particular at work on prevention, risk mitigation, disaster risk reduction, and building of resilience. And then the third pillar, looking at greening UNHCR's own operations and seeking to reduce our carbon footprint. So this strategic framework on climate action is based on a protection-centered approach, reflecting UNHCR's protection mandate, and it's aligned with the provisions of the 2018 Global Compact on refugees, which recognises that while not in themselves causes of refugee movements, in most cases, climate, environmental degradation and disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee flows. The compact also calls for steps to be taken around protection, disaster preparedness, and inclusion of refugees in disaster risk reduction strategies, bearing in mind that many of them live in countries and regions that are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It also calls for early warning systems, access to sustainable energy in refugee settings, and other concrete measures in this regard. So it's a comprehensive framework that really addresses many different aspects of this issue in which UNHCR sees an urgent need for action and a need for us to be taking proactive steps as part of wider UN efforts in that regard. But it also recognises that UNHCR can only have an impact in this area if it works closely together with its partners. Once this is finalised, the aim is that the strategic framework is going to be operationalised through the development of specific regional plans of action. And these will aim to build on the existing excellent work that's been done in many parts of the world on addressing risks linked to climate change, including in the IGAD region, and building on some of the many important tools and analysis that have already been mentioned in the course of our discussion today. So allow me now to turn to the legal and normative pillar in particular. And this is the section of UNHCR's work that myself and my team work on as part of protection, policy and legal advice. And this continues efforts that we've undertaken in previous years in seeking to contribute to discussing and developing guidance on the application of existing international instruments to address the needs for protection of people displaced across borders. It builds notably on the work that we have sought to do together with partners in the context of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and our contributions to the Nansen Initiative Agenda for the Protection of Cross-Border Displaced Persons, the Nansen Protection Agenda in that regard. It builds on research that we have done over recent years and other work undertaken also in the context of the UNFCCC's Task Force on Displacement within the framework of the Paris Accord. So the specific tool that I'd like to mention today is UNHCR's recently released in October of last year, legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disaster. And this document's been issued in fulfillment of UNHCR's function in seeking to provide guidance on the interpretation and application of international refugee law instruments. And the paper aims, amongst other things, to demonstrate the circumstances in which refugee law may be relevant to addressing the protection needs of people forced to cross borders in the context of displacement linked to disaster and climate change, underlining that there are circumstances in which international refugee law, as well as international human rights law, may apply. It's based on a legally authoritative interpretation of the criteria in the refugee definition in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, as well as regional instruments. And I'll turn to those in a bit more detail in a minute. It underlines that people displaced across borders in the context of climate change or disaster may have a well-founded fear of persecution or may be compelled to seek refuge abroad, particularly where climate change acts as a threat multiplier, affecting people's enjoyment of their human rights and where their state is unable or unwilling to provide protection. And under those circumstances, where these criteria are fulfilled, they may well fall within the international definition of a refugee. This can occur also particularly in circumstances where the effects of climate change and disaster interact with conflict or indiscriminate violence. And we issued a study back in 2018 entitled In Harm's Way, which has documented specific circumstances in the Horn of Africa, as well as in the Americas, in which we have seen that interaction between conflict and climate change, and the responses of states who have received claims from people seeking refugee status in those circumstances. The document also, as I've mentioned, looks specifically at the applicability of regional refugee instruments. And key amongst these is the 1969 OAU Convention relating to the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. And this is very significant because that instrument, in addition to incorporating the definition of a refugee from the 1951 Refugee Convention, has an additional set of criteria referring, amongst other things, to people who may need refugee status where they are fleeing from events seriously disturbing public order. And UNHCR in these legal considerations analyses circumstances in which disasters, including sudden onset disasters, but also potentially slow onset effects of climate change, could well constitute events seriously disturbing public order within the definition, a refugee definition of the OAU Convention. The paper also looks at the potential applicability of human rights law instruments, noting amongst other things that the Human Rights Committee in a decision some months ago has specifically recognized that there may be situations in which threats to life in a country of origin may be as such as to trigger the principle of non-refoulement, and requiring states therefore to refrain from returning people to face such threats. The paper also talks about the potential application of complementary and temporary forms of protection or humanitarian forms of stay, which may be relevant for people who do not fall within the definition of a refugee, but who cannot be returned home because of threats to their rights. It's important perhaps to underline that these legal considerations do recognize that there is no such category in international law as climate refugees. We agree with Nina in this regard that the term climate refugees can be confusing and can also give rise to unnecessary concerns that UNHCR or others are seeking to argue that there is a new category in international law or new obligations going beyond the scope of existing instruments. The analysis in the legal considerations make clear we are not seeking to expand the scope of the existing refugee definition, but rather seeking to contextualize and explain its potential relevance and correct interpretation in light of current circumstances that we see in several regions worldwide. While we acknowledge, therefore, that refugee and human rights law may not always be applicable to movements across borders in the context of climate change and disaster, but where there are circumstances that could give rise to protection needs, where there could be a link to refugee protection criteria, it's important that authorities examine claims for refugee protection in those contexts and analyse and consider carefully the potential applicability of those criteria as a grounds for granting international protection. So what is it that UNHCR intends to do further on the basis of this document? It's important for us that this is not something which simply exists as another piece of paper from a UN body, but that it contributes to reflection and discussion, to awareness and understanding of the potential relevance of these instruments, and will be applied in circumstances where it is relevant. We're seeking, therefore, over the next few months to build dialogue and garner support for the interpretation and the concepts that are elucidated in this document with our key partners. And amongst these, we are looking at having a consultation in the next month, specifically with the African Union and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Their interest lies specifically in the applicability of the OEU Convention in this regard, and that will be an important opportunity for us to discuss this further. The discussions that we will seek to have also aim to contribute to the work of existing regional and international fora, including the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the Task Force on Displacement, the international discussions that we hope to have in Glasgow in the deferred COP26 later this year. We're also seeking to have an ongoing dialogue with human rights bodies that are increasingly finding before them cases relating to these kinds of situations. We're also going to be looking at discussing ways in which work on climate change and disaster displacement can be carried forward in implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees, mindful that this was a topic which received considerable attention in the course of the Global Refugee Fora, and that states that have taken part in the Global Compact have signalled their strong interest in exploring this further. We also want to continue to contribute constructively to work on the advancement of discussions around migration, bearing in mind, as Nina has said, that there is a spectrum of human mobility that is in issue here, and the important provisions that have been included in the Global Compact on Migration. UNHCR is part of the UN Network on Migration, established to support states in implementing the Global Migration Compact. And so that's a place where we hope we can support work on the migration aspect of responses to climate change and disaster, including potentially the creation of opportunities for legal and regular movement as a means of averting the need for people to be displaced in the face of these phenomena. An important part of our discussions are also with judges very interested in this issue, who also wish to seek to move towards more consistent and informed approaches to interpreting refugee criteria in cases before them. And we also want to look at trying to advance our research agenda. We're looking at we want to broaden our examination of state practice in this regard, as well as jurisprudence of national and regional bodies examining cases linked to claims for protection and others otherwise related to climate litigation. And we want to consider the potential also of issuing further guidance to be informed by that research at later stages, as we all gain more experience in responding to people who are seeking protection in this context. So thanks once again for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the questions and discussions, and want to once again underline how much we appreciate the opportunity to dialogue here with this very diverse audience that we see on the call, including a lot of people who are dealing day to day with the realities of the challenges that climate change is creating on the ground. Thanks very much.